Picture this, it's November 1st, 2015, and you're sitting in a sold-out Kauffman Stadium in Kansas City. That's the end of the big name free agency signings, but that doesn't mean it's the end of big name trades. That's right, because that offseason, the Oakland Athletics dealt Josh Donaldson to Toronto for some prospects who, let's face it, never lived up to expectations. Similar to losing Max Scherzer in free agency, the Tigers lost yet another pitcher, this time Rick Porcello, who was traded to Boston in exchange for Cespedes. Back over to the West Coast, and the Padres made massive moves via trade. First, they traded for Justin Upton and Matt Kemp. However, topped their offseason off with one last 3-team deal for Will Myers. This final trade involved 11 different prospects, so I do think it is worth mentioning Trey Turner was a part of the package the Padres sent to Washington in order to secure Myers. You might be asking yourself, wow, the Padres went all out this offseason by signing James Shields and trading for Justin Upton, Matt Kemp, and Will Myers. And you would be right, because that offseason the Padres were bought by the late Peter Seidler, who ended up hiring the now notorious AJ Preller as their general manager. This would be the beginning of the spending era in San Diego. Finally, this offseason, the St. Louis Cardinals made a huge trade to acquire Jason Hayward from the Braves. Now, I know we don't think of Jason Hayward as an amazing player in 2025, but you're about to see firsthand how Jason Hayward pushed the Cardinals over the edge and turned them into the best team in baseball, for a period of time at least. But just because the Cardinals would go on to have an amazing season doesn't mean they were predicted to. Before the start of the season, ESPN polled their baseball writers and asked them who they thought would win the World Series. An overwhelming majority of people voted for the Washington Nationals, but in second place, the writers voted for the Los Angeles Dodgers. They also predicted the Boston Red Sox, Cleveland Indians, Seattle Mariners, and St. Louis Cardinals would all win their divisions. Some of these predictions would age well, and some would age bad, but there was one prediction on this list that not only ended up being completely wrong, but ended up being so wrong it created an organizational nightmare. But now it's time for MLB season. Oh wait, there's just one more thing I forgot to mention.
Our special Major League meeting, and we've just concluded. Mr. Rob Manfred elected the 10th Commissioner of Baseball.
That's right, the 2015 MLB season was also Rob Manfred's first as commissioner. So what are the odds it also went on to become one of the best seasons in Major League Baseball history? The 2015 MLB season would start off as poetic as it ended up finishing. After the Kansas City Royals lost the 2014 World Series to the San Francisco Giants, they still had expectations. But winning the first 7 games of the season while finishing April with the best record in the AL Central, being tied for most wins in the MLB, and ending April with the best run differential in MLB absolutely smashed those expectations. But over in the National League, the New York Mets might have been better. The Mets would end up winning 11 games in a row during the month of April, mainly due to their pitching. But little did we know one of the best pitchers on their team was about to be called up in May. But just because the Mets won 11 games in a row didn't mean they were the best team in their division. The Washington Nationals' shiny new free agency acquisition of Max Scherzer was absolutely shoving on the mound, and their 22-year-old superstar Bryce Harper was on pace for the best season of his career. A kid who wasn't even old enough to rent cars was about to have one of, if not the best season in Nationals history. So why were the Nationals 3 games under 500 at the end of April? They were in 4th place in the division, and the only reason they weren't in last place was because Bryce Harper and Max Scherzer were carrying them to around 500 baseball. Over in the NL Central, things seemed competitive with 4 teams at or above 500, but the St. Louis Cardinals were about to showcase why they were levels above the division and the rest of the league. The NL West was going just about as expected, but oh my god, are the Houston Astros leading the AL West? This is the same team that just lost 92 games last season, and over 100 games the last 3 seasons before that. How are they in first place? Well, Jose Altuve, the Silver Slugger's second baseman who broke out last season, was taking his game to an entirely new level in 2015. Staying in the American League, but across the country in the AL East, things weren't going as planned. The once first place predicted Boston Red Sox were second in the division, but their new free agency acquisitions were terrible. Surely they'll turn it around though, right? Well, we're gonna find out later if they did. Because as of April, the New York Yankees were in first place, and the Toronto Blue Jays were somehow in last, despite the fact that Josh Donaldson was hitting .320 with 11 extra base hits in the month of April, and Kevin Pillar was finally breaking out. The Jays were still under 500. The 2015 MLB season was special, but May might have been the most special month. In May of 2015, Giancarlo Stanton was a man possessed, hitting 12 homers in a single month, but more importantly, hitting multiple 460-foot moonshots, including this 475-foot nuke at Dodger Stadium on May 12th.
Stanton drives it left field, absolutely.
This is certainly amazing, but it sucks when you find out all of these homers were for nothing, as the Marlins finished May 11 games under 500 and 4th in the NL East. Who was in first place? Well, it was the now surging Washington Nationals, whose own Bryce Harper was having an even better month than Giancarlo Stanton. In May, Harper slugged over 800, hit 13 home runs, and had 6 multi-homer games in May. This tied the MLB record for the most multi-home run games in a single month. But who was just a half game back in the division? Well, it was the New York Mets, who had surged towards the top of the National League, especially after calling up rookie Noah Syndergaard, who would go on to become one of the best starters in the entire NL. Over in the NL Central, the St. Louis Cardinals continued to dominate the division. They had a 6-game lead over the second-place Chicago Cubs, whose rise was mainly due to Chris Bryant. Bryant was a former second overall pick who by the end of May had already accumulated 7 home runs while having an OPS just under 900. But over in the NL West, the San Francisco Giants might have had a rookie better than Bryant. Although the Dodgers still led the division, the Giants still made it close, and Matt Duffy helped a lot. The rookie third baseman had a solid bat, but where he truly excelled was defense. If the Giants could keep it close with the Dodgers, they had a real chance at going back-to-back. Staying in the West, but hopping over to the AL, how are the Astros still in first place? Not just that, they've extended their division lead to 4 games. Well, I'll tell you how they did it. One man, Dallas Keuchel. Keuchel was solid in 2014, but playing for a terrible Astros team, so not too many people cared. But throughout May, Keuchel had a 1.76 ERA, and the Astros were one of the best teams in the American League. People had to pay attention now. Unlike the AL East, which honestly was terrible. The Yankees were in first place, but they were just 1 game over 500. The Rays were in second place, led by Evan Longoria and Kevin Kiermaier, who was in the midst of a breakout season, but they didn't have the money to compete. Baltimore was fun with Chris Davis having a dominant season and Manny Machado blossoming into a superstar, but there wasn't much talent besides them. As for the Boston Red Sox and the Toronto Blue Jays, there was talent on the teams, they just weren't producing as expected. But that was all about to change, for one team at least. Over in the AL Central, things were status quo. The Royals were good and the Tigers were just behind them. But somehow, out of nowhere, the Twins were in first place. Well, you see, in the month of May, Minnesota went 20-7 and completely leapfrogged the division. This seemed like it would be an amazing season for the Twins. However, as we would see, 1 month would really not define their entire season. Moving on to June, June was one of the best months of the season. Not just because of the baseball that was played in the month, but also because of the legendary 2015 MLB draft that took place in the middle of the month. But before we get there, let's talk about what happened on the diamond. While the National League looked similar with the Dodgers, Nationals, and Cardinals all remaining in first place, the American League was the complete opposite. Although the Astros were still in first place, it wasn't because their division was bad. After all, the Los Angeles Angels were just 4 games back, and their superstar Mike Trout was in the midst of what could be another MVP season. However, the Astros called up former number 1 overall pick Carlos Correa, and he was electric. In May alone, Correa hit 14 extra base hits, 5 being home runs, and had an OPS approaching 900. He was the boost the Astros needed, but he wasn't the only rookie showing out at this time. In this very same month, the Cubs called up Kyle Schwarber, and the Indians called up Francisco Lindor. The NL and AL Rookie of the Year race was all set. All of the candidates had been called up by the end of June, all except for one, but we'll get to him next month. Moving on to the AL Central, the Royals once again took over first place from the Twins, who, let's just say, finally came back down to reality. Over in the AL East, things were as chaotic as ever. The Orioles and Rays were somehow tied for first place. The Yankees were just a half game back, and the Blue Jays were just 1 game back. But the Boston Red Sox, man, the Boston Red Sox had completely fallen apart at this point, and it made no sense. I mean, seriously, there was so much talent on this team. They had Mookie Betts, Xander Bogaerts, David Ortiz, and Dustin Pedroia all gracing the lineup. Brock Holt even hit for the cycle in the month of June. But their 2 big free agency acquisitions, Hanley Ramirez and Pablo Sandoval, were terrible. I mean, downright horrendous baseball players. It's hard to get better from last season if you hand out over $100 million to negative WAR players. But that's enough of the disappointing Red Sox. Before we hop into the 2015 MLB draft, I would be remiss if I didn't mention what should have been Max Scherzer's first ever perfect game. Here's the scenario. Max Scherzer has 26 outs, has allowed 0 hits, 0 walks, and most importantly, 0 hit by pitches. He currently has Jose Tabata in a 2-strike count. If he throws just 1 more strike, he will have thrown the 24th perfect game in Major League Baseball history. He has a chance to do something that's only been done 23 times up to that point in over 238,000 games.
And he goes to first base with 2 outs in the 9th. Did it hit him? And that's it for the perfect game. The ball hit Jose Tabata.
Scherzer would strike out the next batter to complete a no-hitter, but this still enraged the baseball community. Tabata clearly leaned into the pitch to end the perfect game. Not only was that against the unwritten rules of baseball, it was just cowardly. Anybody with a heart had to feel bad for Max Scherzer. Sure, he had just thrown a no-hitter, but he was 1 pitch away from a perfect game. Imagine winning $100 when you were just seconds away from winning $1 million. That's how Scherzer must have felt. But that's just how baseball is. It gives and it takes. But now it's time for the 2015 MLB draft. While the MLB draft isn't as commercialized as the NFL or even NBA's draft, it's still extremely important. For example, the number 1 overall pick in 2015's MLB draft was Dansby Swanson, who went on to become one of the best defensive shortstops in the entire MLB. Or what about the 2nd overall pick? Well, that was Alex Bregman, who went on to win multiple World Series rings with the Astros and still has a legitimate chance at the Hall of Fame. What I'm getting at is that this year's draft class was stacked. Kyle Tucker, a man who could potentially get $500 million this upcoming offseason, was drafted 5th overall. Andrew Benintendi, a man who became the number 1 prospect in all of baseball after being selected 7th overall by Boston, eventually signed the biggest contract in Chicago White Sox history. Ian Happ is one of the best defensive left fielders in all of baseball, and he was drafted 9th. The righty killer Josh Naylor was drafted 12th. Austin Riley was drafted 41st. Cedric Mullins was drafted in the 13th round. This draft had it all. Whether you want a Gold Glove outfielder who can stick around in the big leagues for a decade like Trent Grisham, or an all-star closer who in their prime was one of the best bullpen arms in MLB like Ryan Helsley. This draft had anything you could imagine. For example, although he didn't sign, the Atlanta Braves drafted Jeremy Pena in the 39th round. That's right, Jeremy Pena, the one that would go on to win ALCS MVP, World Series MVP with the Astros. For those reasons, I'm just gonna go ahead and say it. The 2015 MLB draft was a massive success. But back to the play on the diamond. July was once again the status quo for the National League. The Dodgers once again led the NL West with the Giants trailing close behind. The Washington Nationals led the NL East with the Mets trailing close behind them. But in the NL Central, something devastating was on the verge of happening. The St. Louis Cardinals, who had the best record in all of baseball, had a terrible July. They went just 15-12, meaning the 2nd place Pittsburgh Pirates had a chance to make a run at the division. The Cardinals, led by Matt Carpenter, Randall Grichuk, John Lackey, and Lance Lynn, were set to face off against the Pittsburgh Pirates, who featured prime Andrew McCutchen, Starling Marte, and a young Garrett Cole, and KBO phenom Young Ho Kang. I wouldn't blame you if you ended up thinking the Pirates had a better roster. But I left out one player. Remember Jason Hayward, the player the Cardinals traded for from Atlanta? Well, he was having the best season of his career. So although the Pirates would cut the Cards' lead to just 5.5 games, that's the lowest their lead ever was for the remainder of the season. As for the American League, the Astros still led the Angels by 2 games in the West. The Royals extended their lead over Minnesota by nearly 10 games. innings, signaling the early end to Minnesota's season. However, I do have to note July was the month Minnesota called up Miguel Sano. The 22-year-old Dominican was electric in July. He hit nearly 300 with an OPS approaching 1,000. Although he couldn't single-handedly save the Twins season, he was extremely fun to watch and even had a chance to win Rookie of the Year. Now, moving on to the AL East, it's just as chaotic as it's been all season. The Yankees somehow jumped the Orioles and the Rays. The Rays fell to 4th place, and the Blue Jays were just average. The Red Sox, though, yeah, still terrible. July also featured MLB's annual All-Star Game, as well as the more prominent Home Run Derby. This year, the festivities were hosted at Great American Ballpark, and if you know anything about how Cincinnati likes to celebrate opening day, you better believe the All-Star Game was just as exciting. The All-Star Game ended up being a 6-3 win for the American League, but the real show had to be the Home Run Derby. This year, the rules were much different. 8 players participate in a bracket-style single-elimination derby. Each player had 5 minutes to hit home runs, and could even be awarded extra time for hitting long homers. Hitters were awarded 60 seconds if they hit 2 home runs over 420 feet, and an additional 30 seconds if they hit a home run over 475 feet. These might seem like complicated rules, but it produced one of the best home run derbies of all time. Todd Frazier was the hometown kid playing in Cincinnati. He was drafted by Cincinnati in 2007, developed in their system for 4 years, and then played 5 big league seasons there, 2015 being his 5th. This was his 2nd All-Star appearance, and it was an open secret Todd Frazier was on the trade block. Here's the one thing you need to understand about baseball. Being a fan of a small market team that doesn't like to spend money sucks, especially if they're playing badly. The Reds had a bad team, didn't want to pay Frazier what he was owed, and everyone knew they wanted to dump his salary as soon as possible. It felt like this All-Star event in Cincinnati was a way to say goodbye to the locally developed player. After all, it's not like the Reds were going to win anything anytime soon, but Todd Frazier certainly did.
Hometown hero Todd Frazier acknowledging the fans. This homer beats Prince Fielder in the first round. Frazier in the semis against Josh Donaldson. This long ball sends him into the finals. Jock Peterson the first to swing. 14 long balls. Todd Frazier followed it up with 15. Cincinnati Red wins the 2015 Home Run Derby.
You could really tell how much this meant to Todd Frazier and the Cincinnati Reds fans. If you knew nothing about baseball, it would have looked like Todd Frazier just walked off the World Series for the Reds. This for me was one of the best moments of the season. It was just a pure joy to watch. That's why it makes it even more painful to hear that Todd Frazier was traded to the Chicago White Sox after the 2015 season. But Todd Frazier might have been lucky, because at least he didn't get traded at this season's insane trade deadline. Something similar even happened to Wilmer Flores, who was thought to have been traded in the middle of a game and was even seen crying on the field.
Collins went over to him and he had a heart-to-heart with Wilmer.
However, Flores would remain on the team to the appreciation of many Mets fans. Aside from this extremely human aspect of baseball, this trade deadline was insane. The Mets traded for Yoenis Cespedes and the Royals traded for Johnny Cueto and Ben Zobrist. But the Blue Jays somehow got David Price from the Tigers. This has to be the biggest trade of the deadline. Well, no, because actually the Blue Jays also acquired one of the best shortstops in baseball in Troy Tulowitzki from the Rockies. They certainly gave up a ton of prospects for Tulo and Price, but they were unstoppable now. They had Jose Bautista, Troy Tulowitzki, and Josh Donaldson in the midst of an MVP caliber season all in their lineup. Plus, with an ace like David Price on the mound, who was pitching like a Cy Young candidate at the time, who could stop the Blue Jays? Now, moving on to August. In August alone, the Blue Jays went 21-6 and leapfrogged to the top of the AL East. With just 2 trades, the Blue Jays had become the best team in the American League. That is, just besides the Kansas City Royals. The Royals had the best record in the American League, and the 2014 pennant winners had solidified their grasp of the division by early August, led by the unlikely star Lorenzo Cain. The Royals were juggernauts. Did Lorenzo Cain have huge home run power? No, absolutely not. But he was one of the best players in baseball and was having an AL MVP caliber season. This basically defined the Royals season. nobody was a generational talent or bona fide face of the franchise, but they all were good at defense, base running, extending base hits into doubles. The Royals were extremely good at the fundamentals of baseball. If there was a face of the team, it'd have to either be Eric Hosmer or Salvador Perez. Hosmer was the young first baseman who could hit a home run, but equally as likely could rip a gap double. Perez might have been just 25 years old, but by this time, he was already a multi-time All-Star and Gold Glove winner. Those two definitely were the faces of the Royals. But moving on from the AL Central, the AL West had become the most volatile division in the entire AL. Although the Astros were still on top of the West, the Texas Rangers had an 18-win August that catapulted them into contention for the division crown. As for the National League, same old, same old. The Dodgers had a slight lead over San Francisco, the Cardinals had the best record in MLB, and oh my god, the Nationals' entire season just fell apart. Well, to be honest, it's kind of a mix of the fact that the Nationals had a terrible August and that the Mets had an amazing August. For example, aside from Bryce Harper and Max Scherzer, the Nationals were terrible. Harper hit 327 with an OPS over 900 in August, but at that same time, the Nats went just 12-17. As for the Mets, they were red hot. In August, the Mets went 20-8. Sure, it did help that the Mets had pitchers like Jacob deGrom, Noah Syndergaard, and Matt Harvey, but trade deadline acquisition Yoenis Cespedes was the best player on the team. As a Met in 2015, Cespedes had a slug over 600 and finished with an OPS nearing 1,000. He was the fire the Mets needed to get hot. That's how the Mets completely flipped the scripts on the Nationals and became the most dominant team in the NL East. But with 1 month left in the season, and although the Mets did hold a 6.5 game lead over the Nationals, anything was still possible. Now moving on to September. I know it seems like September is the worst month in baseball. All the divisions are basically locked up. How could it be really that interesting? Well, the wild card race this season needed every single game of the 162 game season to be fully decided. Although the Blue Jays ran away with the AL East, the Yankees and Astros both finished just 2 and 1 game ahead of the Angels in the wild card race. Wait, did I just say the Astros? Yes, that's right. The Astros, who were atop the AL West for most of the season, dropped the crown to the Rangers after Texas had another 18-win month in September. As for the Astros, their final month was abysmal, as their record in September was 5 games under 500. However, atop of the American League sat the Kansas City Royals with a record of 95-67. You could argue they beat up on a weak American League Central, but Minnesota came just 3 wins away from making the wild card. It wasn't a terrible division, but over in the National League, it was clear which division was the best. Although the Dodgers and Mets won their divisions with 92 and 90 wins respectively, nearly the entire NL Central was better. The St. Louis Cardinals finished the season with an MLB best 100 wins. As for the Pirates, they were close behind with 98, and the Chicago Cubs had 97, meaning the top 3 teams record-wise in MLB were all from the NL Central. So naturally, the Cubs and Pirates filled up the 2 NL wildcard slots, with the San Francisco Giants being the next closest team, trailing the Cubs 13 games out of the wildcard. The playoffs were now officially set. The questions remaining were just, would one of the NL Central powerhouses win the NL? Could anybody stop the star-studded Blue Jays? How much of a threat were the Royals and Mets to their respective leagues? But most importantly, who won the MVP and Cy Young awards this year? So before we hop into one of the best playoffs of all time, it's time to see who won MVP, Cy Young, and Rookie of the Year in each league. First, I'm going to start off in the National League because there is way more controversy in the AL. The winner of the 2015 NL MVP award was Bryce Harper, and this is by far and away the best choice for the award. Harper led the entire MLB in B WAR, led the NL in runs, home runs, OBP, slug, and OPS. His OPS of 1.109 in 2015 stood as the Nationals' highest single season OPS in franchise history. This was a historic season for Bryce Harper, wasted by an incompetent national team down the stretch. As for the NL Cy Young, things got a lot more controversial. The winner of the 2015 NL Cy Young Award was Jake Arrieta, and I can see why people agree with this decision. Arrieta led the NL in wins, had over 8 BWAR, an ERA of 1.77, and had an NL leading 4 complete games, 3 being shutouts. He was absolutely phenomenal for the Cubbies in 2015. But you could also argue that Zack Greinke absolutely deserved to win it as well. Greinke had a higher BWAR, an NL leading 1.66 ERA, and although he didn't have the complete games Arrieta had, Greinke was statistically a more effective pitcher. However, either pitcher honestly could have won this award, unlike the NL Rookie of the Year award, where everybody knew who was going to win it. The winner of the 2015 Rookie of the Year was Chris Bryant, who had over 1.4 more BWAR than the next closest finishers. Matt Duffy and Noah Syndergaard both had great seasons, but Bryant had played nearly every game, all while hitting 26 homers, having 99 RBIs, and having elite defense on the hot corner. It was clear Bryant was the winner. Unlike over in the American League, where you could argue 3 separate players should have won the award. The real winner of the AL Rookie of the Year award was Carlos Correa, who led all American League rookies in BWAR, home runs, and RBIs. But Francisco Lindor wasn't far behind in any of those categories, despite finishing second in them. As for Miguel Sano, he had a higher OPS than both Lindor and Correa, and was on pace to lap both of them statistically. However, he played nearly 20 less games than them. I believe Correa is the true Rookie of the Year, but I feel with Twins and Indian fans who think otherwise. As for the AL Cy Young Award, things began to get a little bit more complicated. The winner of the 2015 AL Cy Young was Dallas Keuchel, who posted an AL leading 6.6 BWAR, posting an ERA of 2.48 while leading the AL in innings pitched and WHIP. However, David Price was right behind him with 6.3 BWAR and an AL best 2.48 ERA. To make matters even more close, his ERA plus was 7 points higher than Keuchel's was as well. The AL Cy Young seems close, but I promise you it will not compare to the robbery that was the AL MVP award. In 2015, Josh Donaldson took home the AL MVP award after putting up a 7.4 BWAR season, smashing 41 home runs and driving in an AL leading 123 RBIs. These are great numbers and worthy of winning MVP in any other season except this one. Why? Because Mike Trout was simply better than him. Mike Trout had over 2 more WAR than Donaldson. Let that sink in. For most of these awards, the first and second place finishers are within just 1 WAR from another. Mike Trout had over 2 more WAR than Donaldson. Not only that, he had the same amount of home runs, more triples, a higher batting average, a higher on-base percentage, a higher slug, and OPS. Basically, anything you could think of, Mike Trout had more than Josh Donaldson. Now, this isn't a slight at Donaldson's season whatsoever. It's more so a representation of how voter fatigue can ruin a legacy. Mike Trout led the AL in BWAR 5 years in a row, but won just 2 MVP awards while finishing in second place the other 3 times. But that's enough award debate. It's time to talk about something nobody can debate: the absolutely legendary playoffs of the 2015 season. Even in the wild card round, the MLB playoffs produced some of the best games of the 2015 season. The American League wild card was pretty one-sided. Over the course of 9 innings, the Houston Astros would score 3 runs to blank the New York Yankees 3-0. But it is important to note that Dallas Keuchel locked down the Bronx Bombers, pitching 6 innings while striking out 7 batters and allowing just 3 hits. But the National League wild card, that's where things get insane. The Chicago Cubs would take an early lead they would never relinquish, but only because Jake Arrieta threw one of the best games of his career. Arrieta tossed a complete game shutout, striking out 11 batters and giving up just 5 hits. Jake Arrieta became the first pitcher in postseason history to throw a shutout while striking out at least 10 and not walking a single batter. That wasn't just dominant, it was historic. But what if I told you this doesn't even scratch the top 3 most iconic moments of the 2015 playoffs? In the divisional series, the New York Mets were battling the Los Angeles Dodgers in one of the best National League playoff series of all time. Why? Because of the elite pitching on both ends. Jacob deGrom was dominant in a Mets Game 1 victory. Then Zack Greinke was dominant in a Game 2 victory for the Dodgers. The same thing happened again. Matt Harvey was dominant in a Game 3 victory for the Mets. However, Clayton Kershaw then dominated for a Game 4 victory for the Dodgers. This meant it all came down to Game 5. But in a series dominated by pitching, it was Daniel Murphy who stole the show.
He's not.
There were 2 runners on base with just 1 out for Zach Greinke. All he needed was a ground ball to get out of the inning. But then
the third baseman is Justin Turner, who's still on the right side. Nobody over there to cover. In the air, Ethier over by the line.
What came afterwards was even better.
The 3-2 is driven to right. That ball is gone.
This was absolutely electric. But is it as electric as the Chicago Cubs knocking off the MLB best 100-win Cardinals in 4 games? That's right. The gritty Cubbies, powered by back-to-back home runs by Anthony Rizzo and Chris Bryant in Game 3, defeated the St. Louis Cardinals in a 4-game set. But more importantly, this marked the first time in MLB history the Chicago Cubs have won a playoff series at Wrigley Field. But now it's time for what you've all been waiting for. The most iconic bat flip in MLB history. The Toronto Blue Jays faced off against the Texas Rangers, and immediately the Rangers went ahead 2-0. One more win and Toronto would be sent packing. Could the MVP Josh Donaldson step up? Could trade acquisition Troy Tulowitzki show up? Could ace and Cy Young runner-up David Price show up? The answer was no. None of them showed up. Jose Bautista did instead. The Blue Jays would tie up the series 2-2 to force a Game 5. And in the bottom of the 7th, Jose Bautista hit a 3-run home run that was heard all around the world. You don't even need to watch baseball. If you were alive in 2015, you for sure saw that clip. It is the baseball equivalent to the Odell Beckham Jr. catch. This would seal off the Blue Jays Game 5 victory, and the only question remaining was who will they face in the ALCS, the Royals or the Astros? After the first 3 games of the series, the Houston Astros jumped out to a convincing 2-1 lead. To make matters worse, Game 4 was in Houston, meaning not only did Houston have home field advantage, if they lost this game or Game 5, the Royals season was over. Going into the top of the 8th inning in Game 4, the Houston Astros led the Kansas City Royals 6-2. The Royals needed to score 5 runs in 6 outs to win the game. Their season was practically over. Then something happened. Alex Rios, Alcides Escobar, and Ben Zobrist all hit singles to load the bases. Then, guess what happened next? Lorenzo Cain hit another single. This was now a 3-run game. The Astros then pulled Will Harris in favor of Tony Sipp, but that didn't matter. Eric Hosmer then hit a single to score another run. Kendrys Morales reached on an error to score 2 more runs, and even if you could blink, the Royals had just tied the game. 1 walk, stolen base, and a strikeout later, and Alex Gordon would ground out to give Kansas City the lead. A lead they would never give up the remainder of the game. With that, the championship series was set. The New York Mets would face off against the Chicago Cubs in the National League, and the Kansas City Royals would face off against the Toronto Blue Jays in the American League. For the New York Mets, the NLCS was a breeze. After a dominant Matt Harvey outing in Game 1, Noah Syndergaard would dominate in Game 2. Then Jacob deGrom would again dominate on the bump in Game 3 before Steven Matz and Bartolo Colon combined for 7 strong innings to sweep the series for the Mets in Game 4. In the 4-game sweep, the Mets pitching staff allowed just 8 runs. For reference, the Mets scored 8 runs alone in Game 4. Now, over in the American League, things were a little bit bumpier. After scoring 11 runs in the first 2 games, the Kansas City Royals jumped out to a quick 2-0 lead. However, after this quick series lead, the 2 teams would trade blowouts. First, the Blue Jays won after scoring 11 runs. Then the Royals won after scoring 14 runs. The blowout even ensued into Game 5 after the Blue Jays beat the Royals by 6 runs. However, Game 6 was anything but a blowout. After the Royals took a 3-1 lead heading into the top of the 8th inning, the Kansas City faithful felt confident. After all, there were just 2 innings left, and Ryan Madson, a man with a 2.13 ERA in the regular season, was pitching. But after a Ben Reverie single and a Josh Donaldson strikeout, something happened. Something oh so eerily similar to the prior round. That's right, Jose Bautista happened.
That is hit down the line and left into the corner, and this game is tied. It's a 3-3 game here in the 8th inning.
For a second, all hope was ripped from Royals fans' hearts. Yeah, the game was just tied, and even if the Royals lost this game, they'd have Game 7, but it didn't matter. The last time Jose Bautista did something like that, the other team got eliminated. The Royals could not lose this game, and that's exactly what they did behind Eric Hosmer.
That's into right field. This ball is down. Going to third is Kane. Kane coming to the corner. Royals lead.
Lorenzo Cain scoring from first base on a single would end up securing the series for Kansas City. Not even Jose Bautista could stop the Royals from winning back-to-back American League pennants. But finally, after 7 months, hundreds of baseball games, thousands of at-bats, millions of moments made, we had our 2015 World Series matchup, the New York Mets versus the Kansas City Royals. This World Series wasn't just any other World Series matchup. It represented something special. You see, for the majority of the early 2000s, 3 teams regularly dominated the World Series: the Boston Red Sox, the St. Louis Cardinals, and the San Francisco Giants. In fact, from 2000 to 2015, those 3 teams had won a combined 8 World Series championships, meaning 3 franchises won over half of the entire World Series championships in a decade-and-a-half span. Not only did this World Series matchup represent new teams, it also represented 2 franchises who desperately needed a world title. For the Mets, they haven't won a World Series since 1986, and for the Royals, this would mark their first World Series since 1985, 1 year sooner than the Mets. With that being said, who would end their 30-year championship drought first, the Mets or the Royals? Well, Game 1 was anything but easy to decide. With 1 out in the 9th, Alex Gordon did the unthinkable.
Millie's next pitch. Belted to deep center. Back goes Lagares. And gone.
Boom. Game tied. Alex Gordon had just saved the Royals from going down 1-0. Since 1995 in the World Series, the team that wins Game 1 wins 79% of the time. So who would gain this key advantage? The 10th inning came and went scoreless. Then so did the 11th, 12th, 13th, and top of the 14th inning. So what made the difference in the bottom of the 14th? Well, yet again, it was Eric Hosmer.
Into right, Granderson back. Here comes Escobar. The Royals win Game 1.
Despite the first game being an absolute thriller, Games 2 and 3 were blowouts. The Royals won Game 2 7-1, while the Mets won Game 3 9-3. But Game 4 brought back the dramatic action that Game 1 had. Facing a 3-2 deficit in the 8th inning, the Royals needed a miracle to tie the game, and a miracle they did get.
Chopper on the infield. Can't turn toe. Murphy boots it. Into scores.
The Royals were so close. They were just 1 win away from winning the franchise's first World Series in 30 years. There was just one problem. Entering the 9th inning, the Kansas City Royals had 3 outs to score 2 runs to force extra innings. Otherwise, the Mets were back in this series. But one Lorenzo Cain walk and stolen base later, Eric Hosmer was at bat, and the playoff hero made magic happen yet once again.
That's in the air to left. 1 run scores in the tying run to second, Hosmer.
After a Hosmer double and a Mike Moustakas ground out, Eric Hosmer still managed to find a way to make magic happen.
Broken back. Throw it home. Royals tie the game.
The Kansas City Royals had done the impossible. They had tied the game to force extra innings. But more importantly, after 2 scoreless innings, the Royals had managed to score runs. Not just 1, not just 2, or 3, or 4. The Royals had scored 5 runs in the top of the 12th inning. And before anybody could say anything, they had just made history.
The 1-2 again. Inside corner. The Royals, 2015 World Champions.
In front of Citi Field, the Kansas City Royals had done it. They were World Series champions. Not only that, but they had managed to avenge their 2014 World Series loss as well. This was one of the best playoffs of all time. But what if I told you it negatively impacted the world of baseball in more ways than one? You see, in my opinion, the 2015 World Series actually hurt baseball. Not because the playoffs or World Series weren't spectacular, because they were amazing products, but because of the message it sent to baseball. For the Royals, it told ownership they could get away with not spending money and they could still win championships. Now, obviously, this was wrong and would end up crippling the franchise, but this was the immediate message afterwards. As for the Mets, you have to remember, this was the Mets before Stephen Cohen, meaning the cheap ownership of the past also viewed this as their team being able to compete without spending money. Basically, this World Series told Major League Baseball they could achieve greatness without spending money, and overall for the MLB, that is not a good message. much. Although I do think Major League Baseball teams have now grown out of that phase and realized teams do need to spend money in order to win, this wasn't a good result for money spending teams. Aside from that, this was one of the best playoffs of all time, in my opinion. Two teams who were never predicted to be in the World Series battled it out to secure the world title in extra innings. Nothing gets better than that. Other than that, I'm curious, what was your favorite moment of the 2015 season? Was there a moment I missed? Do you think that your team deserved to make it further in the playoffs that year? But more importantly, what do you think should have changed in the 2015 season to make it the best season of all time? That's all I have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, please subscribe, leave a like, and I'll see you guys on the next one.